Welcome to Marple Mysteries, where every clue matters, and every secret has a story. Join us on a journey through Agatha Christie's most intriguing mysteries, narrated with immersive storytelling. Stay sharp, listen closely, and let's solve the case together. The mystery begins now. Chapter 1. A Gathering at Gossington Hall. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the immaculately kept lawn of Gossington Hall, where Colonel and Mrs. Bantry had arranged their annual garden party with customary precision. The event had become something of an institution in the village of St. Mary Mead, marking the unofficial beginning of the summer social season. White-clothed tables dotted the expansive garden, laden with cucumber sandwiches, scones, and Mrs. Bantry's famous Victoria sponge cake. A small string quartet played Vivaldi in the corner of the terrace, providing a genteel backdrop to the hum of conversation. Miss Jane Marple, her thin frame draped in a modest floral dress that had seen several summers come and go, sat under the shade of an ancient oak tree, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she observed the gathering. At 82, she maintained the sharp blue eyes and alert demeanor that had served her so well throughout her life. The villagers of St. Mary Mead often dismissed her as a harmless, gossipy spinster, little knowing that behind her mild exterior lay one of the most astute minds in England. "Ah, Miss Marple, I was hoping you'd grace us with your presence today," said Mrs. Bantry, approaching with a tall, distinguished gentleman in tow. "May I introduce Mr. Edgar Thornfield? He's staying at the Blue Boar for a fortnight while researching local history for his new book." Miss Marple smiled gently, setting aside her knitting. "How do you do, Mr. Thornfield? St. Mary Mead has quite a rich history, if one knows where to look." Thornfield, a man in his early 50s with silver-streaked dark hair and intelligent eyes, behind wire-rimmed spectacles, bowed slightly. "The pleasure is mine, Miss Marple. I've heard much about you from Mrs. Bantry." "All exaggeration, I'm sure," Miss Marple replied modestly, though her eyes twinkled. "What period of our humble village's history interests you most?" "The Tudor period, primarily," Thornfield explained. "I'm particularly interested in the old priory ruins on the edge of the village. I believe they hold clues to a rather fascinating case of political intrigue during Henry VIII's reign." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sir Richard Lacy and his much younger wife, Lady Philippa. Sir Richard, a retired judge with a stern countenance that had intimidated countless criminals, nodded curtly to the assembled guests. Lady Philippa, at least 30 years his junior, smiled brilliantly, her blue eyes scanning the gathering with barely concealed boredom. "The Lacys seem in fine form today," Mrs. Bantry whispered to Miss Marple. "Though, I must say, there's been talk." "There always is, dear," Miss Marple replied mildly, though her eyes followed Lady Philippa's progress through the crowd with interest. The young woman had stopped to speak with Dr. James Haydock, who had recently taken over his father's practice in the village. At 35, Dr. Haydock was considered quite a catch among the unmarried women of St. Mary Mead, with his handsome features and easy manner. Miss Marple noted how Lady Philippa's hand lingered perhaps a fraction too long on the doctor's arm, and how Sir Richard's gaze hardened at the sight. "Fascinating dynamics. Wouldn't you agree, Miss Marple?" Mr. Thornfield murmured, following her line of sight. "Human nature is remarkably consistent, Mr. Thornfield," she replied. "I'm reminded of young Elsie Matthews, who worked at the haberdashery. Such a pretty girl, and so attentive to the vicar's son, despite being engaged to the baker's apprentice." Thornfield looked puzzled by this apparent non-sequitur, but Mrs. Bantry merely smiled, accustomed to Miss Marple's oblique comparisons. The party continued pleasantly as the afternoon wore on. Miss Marple observed how the village solicitor, Mr. Petherick, engaged in what appeared to be a heated discussion with Colonel Bantry near the rose garden. Nearby, the vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement, was deep in conversation with Miss Amanda Hartnell, the village's other notable spinster, and Miss Marple's friendly rival in horticultural matters. It was as the shadows lengthened and the first guests began to make their farewells that the peaceful afternoon was shattered. A piercing scream came from the direction of the stone courtyard that adjoined the east wing of Gossington Hall. Conversation ceased abruptly, the quartet's music trailing off in discord. Colonel Bantry was the first to react, his military training evident as he strode purposefully toward the sound. Dr. Haydock followed closely behind, with Sir Richard Lacy moving with surprising speed for a man of his years. The other guests hesitated, torn between propriety and curiosity. "We should see if we can be of assistance," Miss Marple said, quietly to Mrs. Bantry, who nodded, her face pale. They made their way toward the courtyard, where a small crowd had already gathered. At the center, Clara Jenkins, one of the maids, employed for the occasion, stood trembling, her hands pressed against her mouth. On the flagstones before her lay the crumpled form of Mr. Thornfield, his spectacles askew on his face, a dark stain spreading across his crisp white shirt. Dr. Haydock knelt beside him, checking for signs of life, but the grim set of his mouth told the tale before he spoke. "I'm afraid he's gone," he announced, looking up at the shocked faces surrounding him. "Someone should telephone the police immediately." "What happened, Clara?" Mrs. Bantry asked the distraught maid gently. I just found him like this, ma'am," Clara sobbed. "I was bringing out more cups for the tea service, and he was just lying there." Miss Marple stood slightly apart from the group, her faded blue eyes taking in every detail of the scene. The position of the body, the particular angle at which Mr. Thornfield had fallen, the absence of any obvious weapon. Most of all, she noted the reactions of those gathered: surprise, horror, and, in one case, what might have been the briefest flicker of satisfaction quickly masked by appropriate shock. "Such a dreadful business," she murmured, almost to herself. "Reminds me of poor Mr. Sanderson's unfortunate incident at the church fete last year." Of course, Mr. Sanderson had merely suffered a fainting spell after overindulging in the summer heat, but Miss Marple's mind was already making connections that others would miss. As Colonel Bantry took charge, dispatching servants to telephone the police and keeping the increasingly agitated guests from disturbing the scene, Miss Marple quietly retreated to her previous position under the oak tree. She picked up her knitting once more, her needles clicking steadily as she watched and waited. The peaceful village of St. Mary Mead had been disrupted by violence once again, and experience told her that beneath the surface of this seemingly straightforward tragedy lay a tangle of human passions and secrets that would require her particular talent to unravel. Chapter 2. The village reacts by the following morning. News of Edgar Thornfield's death had spread through St. Mary Mead, with the efficiency that only a small English village could achieve. Miss Marple, tending to her prized dahlias in the front garden, overheard snippets of conversation as neighbors passed by her gate, each offering a different version of events, embellished with increasingly dramatic details. "Good morning, Miss Marple," called Mrs. Price Ridley, the widow who lived 3 doors down. Unable to resist the opportunity for first-hand information, she paused at the gate. "Such a dreadful business at Gossington Hall yesterday. I heard the poor man was poisoned." "Good morning, Mrs. Price Ridley," Miss Marple replied, straightening up with a slight wince at her rheumatic back. "I couldn't possibly say. Inspector Craddock hasn't released any official information yet." "Well, My nephew works at the Blue Boar, and he says this. Mr. Thornfield had been asking all sorts of peculiar questions about the village families, digging into histories that might better remain buried, if you ask me. Mrs. Price Ridley leaned forward conspiratorially. Some say he wasn't a historian at all, but a private investigator. Miss Marple made a non-committal sound, filing away this interesting morsel of information. The hydrangeas are coming along nicely this year, aren't they? All this rain we've had. Mrs. Price Ridley, recognizing that she would get no sensational confirmation from Miss Marple, reluctantly moved on, no doubt to share her theories with the next willing ear. After breakfast, Miss Marple decided a trip to the village shop was in order. Not that she needed anything particular, but the shop, run by Mrs. Jameson, served as the unofficial clearinghouse for village gossip. If there was anything to be learned about Mr. Thornfield or the investigation, it would be circulating there. The little bell above the door tinkled as she entered. 3 women, Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, Miss Hartnell, and Mrs. Dane Calthrop, the somewhat eccentric wife of the neighboring parish's vicar, were gathered near the counter. Their conversation halted abruptly at Miss Marple's entrance. "Jane, we were just talking about yesterday's dreadful events," Miss Hartnell said, recovering first. "Such a terrible thing to happen at poor Dolly Bantry's party." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed, selecting a small ball of darning wool with careful deliberation. "Has anyone heard how the investigation is progressing?" Mrs. Clement lowered her voice. "I heard from Arthur, who spoke with Inspector Craddock this morning, that Mr. Thornfield was stabbed with some sort of narrow blade. They haven't found the weapon yet." "How very peculiar," said Miss Marple mildly. "I don't recall seeing any such instrument near the body. The police have been questioning that maid who found him, Clara Jenkins," put in Mrs. Dane Calthrop. "Apparently she was quite hysterical when they tried to interview her properly. Makes one wonder, doesn't it?" "Clara is a good girl," Mrs. Jameson said firmly, as she wrapped Miss Marple's wool in brown paper. "Been working occasional service at big houses for years without a spot of trouble. Her mother would be devastated if anyone suggested otherwise." But the shop door opened again, and Dr. Haydock entered, looking tired. The conversation once more fell into an awkward pause. "Ladies," he nodded. "Miss Marple, how are you today? No ill effects from yesterday's shock, I hope?" "I'm quite well, thank you, Doctor," Miss Marple replied. "Though I was just wondering about the poor man's family. Has anyone been notified?" Dr. Haydock looked troubled. "That's part of the puzzle, it seems. According to the papers in his room at the Blue Boar, he has a sister in London. Inspector Craddock has been trying to contact her, but with no success yet. Curiously, they also found a press clipping about Sir Richard Lacey's last major case before retirement, that controversial murder trial where the evidence was rather circumstantial." "How very interesting," murmured Miss Marple. "I wonder what connection—" The door opened once more, this time admitting Lady Philippa Lacey. She was dressed in a simple but clearly expensive summer dress, her blonde hair perfectly arranged despite the humid morning. The conversation ceased entirely, and an unmistakable chill descended on the shop. "Good morning," Lady Philippa said, seemingly oblivious to the atmosphere. "Mrs. Jameson, I need some writing paper and envelopes, please, the finest you have." As Mrs. Jameson bustled to fulfill the request, Lady Philippa turned to the assembled women. "Such a ghastly business yesterday. Richard is quite upset. He knew Mr. Thornfield slightly, it turns out. Something to do with one of his old cases." "Indeed?" Miss Marple inquired gently. "How remarkable. Mr. Thornfield didn't mention it when we were introduced." Lady Philippa's composure flickered momentarily. "Yes, well, Richard only realized the connection afterward. He's speaking with the inspector now. She accepted her purchase from Mrs. Jameson with a distracted smile. I must be getting on. Good day, ladies. After she had gone, Miss Hartnell sniffed disapprovingly. Well, I never thought the day would come when I'd see such a person in our village shop. Did you notice her hands? Not a day's honest work in her life. Now, Mrs. Clement chided, though without much conviction. Miss Marple departed shortly after, her mind turning over the morning's revelations. She decided to take a slightly longer route home, one that would pass by the Blue Boar Inn. As she approached, she noticed Inspector Craddock emerging, his lean face set in lines of concentration. "Miss Marple," he greeted her, not entirely without warmth. Their paths had crossed on previous murder investigations, and while he would never admit it openly, he had developed a grudging respect for the elderly spinster's insights. "I suppose you're taking a very great interest in our current problem?" "One can't help but be concerned, Inspector," she replied. "Have you discovered anything of note?" Craddock hesitated. "Nothing I can share officially, but since you were present, we found some rather unusual items among Mr. Thornfield's possessions. Not exactly what one would expect from a historian researching Tudor architecture." "No Tudor manuscripts, then?" Miss Marple asked innocently. "None at all, but several notebooks with details about Sir Richard Lacy's last case before retirement, the Melford poison case, and a press photograph of Dr. Haydock from a medical journal, circled in red ink." He frowned. "I'd appreciate if you'd keep that to yourself for now." "Of course, Inspector," Miss Marple assured him. "Though I must say, it reminds me somewhat of young Tommy Brandon, who came to the village last summer, claiming to be writing an article about country gardens, when in fact he was investigating the disappearance of old Mrs. Whittaker's pearls." Inspector Craddock's brow furrowed. "Are you suggesting Thornfield was not who he claimed to be?" "I couldn't say," Miss Marple replied. "But, in my experience, Inspector, people who ask questions about the past often have very present concerns motivating them." As she continued her walk home, Miss Marple's mind was busy sorting through the various pieces of information she had gathered. The connection to Sir Richard's old case, Lady Philippa's discomfiture, Dr. Haydock's photograph among Thornfield's possessions, all pointed to something far more complex than a random act of violence at a garden party. And somewhere in this web of connections lay the identity of a killer who had struck with precision in the midst of a crowded social gathering, without anyone witnessing the fatal moment. Chapter 3. Quiet Observations. The following afternoon found Miss Marple seated in Dolly Bantry's drawing room, teacup balanced delicately in her thin hands. Gossington Hall seemed subdued, as though the house itself were in mourning for the violence that had occurred in its courtyard. "I simply can't believe it happened here, Jane," Mrs. Bantry said, pouring a second cup for her friend. "Arthur is beside himself. He keeps saying we should have known something about Thornfield before inviting him." "I don't see how you could have," Miss Marple replied reasonably. "He was staying at a reputable establishment, and Mrs. Lacy introduced him to you, did she not?" Mrs. Bantry nodded. "Yes, she met him at the Blue Boar, and took quite a shine to him. Said he was refreshingly intelligent compared to most of the people in this backwater, as she calls it." She lowered her voice. "Between us, I think Sir Richard was rather put out by her interest. He's very protective of her." "That's only natural, I suppose," Miss Marple murmured. "There is quite an age difference between them." 28 years, Mrs. Bantry confirmed. "She was his legal secretary before they married, you know. There was quite the scandal at the time. He was still married to his first wife, though they were separated." Miss Marple absorbed this information with interest. I don't suppose you know anything about the last case Sir Richard presided over? Something called the Melford poison case, I believe. Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened. How extraordinary that you should ask. Arthur was just telling me about it this morning. Inspector Craddock questioned Sir Richard about it extensively. Apparently, it involved a doctor who was accused of poisoning his wealthy wife. The evidence was largely circumstantial, but Sir Richard's summing up to the jury was quite damning, and the man was convicted. He died in prison, I believe. How very tragic, said Miss Marple, especially if there was any doubt. Well, that's just it. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward eagerly. The doctor maintained his innocence to the end, and some years later, evidence came to light suggesting he might have been telling the truth. Nothing conclusive, mind you, but enough to cast a shadow over the conviction. It was too late by then. Of course, Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. And Mr. Thornfield was investigating this case? So it seems. Arthur thinks the man might have been a journalist working on some kind of exposé. Though why he would come to St. Mary Mead is beyond me. Sir Richard hasn't lived here long. Only bought the old Montgomery place 3 years ago. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Colonel Bantry, followed by Dr. Haydock. Both men looked somber. "Ah, Miss Marple," Colonel Bantry said. "Still helping Dolly keep her spirits up, I see." He turned to his wife. "James has just come from the police station. Inspector Craddock has released Thornfield's body, and the inquest is set for Thursday." Dr. Haydock nodded a greeting. "Miss Marple, I didn't expect to see you here today." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Mrs. Bantry was kind enough to invite me for tea. I hope I'm not intruding on a private conversation?" "Not at all," the doctor assured her, though his expression remained guarded. "I was just telling the colonel that the post-mortem confirmed what we suspected. Thornfield was killed by a single thrust from a narrow, sharp instrument, something like a stiletto or letter opener. Death would have been almost instantaneous." "Poor man," murmured Miss Marple. "And in such a public setting, too. One would think someone would have noticed something." "That's the peculiar thing," Colonel Bantry said. "The courtyard was visible from several points in the garden, yet no one saw anything suspicious. The killer must have known the layout of Gossington extremely well." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused momentarily. Or perhaps it was simply opportunity. A moment when attention was diverted elsewhere. The string quartet finished their Vivaldi, and there was that brief pause before they began the Mozart, Mrs. Bantry said suddenly. Everyone was applauding. "I remember because Sir Richard made some comment about the violinist's technique." "What time would that have been?" asked Miss Marple, resuming her knitting. "About 5:30, I should think," replied Mrs. Bantry. "Not long before Clara found him." Dr. Haydock shifted uncomfortably. "Inspector Craddock asked me quite specifically about my movements during that time. Apparently, Lady Philippa mentioned that I had excused myself from our conversation shortly after the Vivaldi concluded. I'm sure the inspector is questioning everyone who was present," Miss Marple said soothingly. "Yes, but it's rather awkward," Dr. Haydock admitted, "especially given what they found among Thornfield's possessions. That photograph of me from the Lancet, circled like some sort of target. And now I learn he was investigating the Melford case." "What connection could you possibly have to that?" asked Colonel Bantry. Dr. Haydock hesitated. "Gerald Melford was a colleague of mine during my hospital training days. We weren't close, but I followed his case with professional interest. I even wrote a letter to the medical journal suggesting that some of the toxicological evidence had been misinterpreted." He ran a hand through his hair. "I had no idea Sir Richard was the judge who sentenced him." A silence fell over the room, broken only by the gentle click of Miss Marple's knitting needles. "Well," said Mrs. Bantry finally, "I'm sure Inspector Craddock will sort it all out. More tea, anyone?" As the conversation turned to safer topics, Miss Marple observed Dr. Haydock carefully. There was tension in his shoulders, and once or twice she caught him glancing toward the window that overlooked the courtyard where Thornfield had died. He was hiding something. That much was clear. But was it guilt over murder, or merely discomfort at being under suspicion? Later, as Miss Marple prepared to leave, she paused in the entrance hall where Clara Jenkins was arranging flowers in a crystal vase. The girl started nervously at Miss Marple's approach. "Oh, Miss Marple, you gave me such a fright." "I'm sorry, my dear," Miss Marple apologized. "Those are lovely roses. From Mrs. Bantry's garden?" "Yes, miss. She said I might arrange them to cheer the place up a bit." Clara's hands trembled slightly as she positioned a deep red bloom. "You're doing a beautiful job," Miss Marple assured her. "I understand you've had a difficult time with the police questioning. Such an ordeal for you, finding poor Mr. Thornfield like that." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "It was awful, miss. I'd never seen a dead person before." "Of course not," said Miss Marple sympathetically. "Though I understand you brought tea out to the courtyard earlier in the afternoon, when Mr. Thornfield was meeting someone there?" Clara looked startled. "Who told you that?" "Oh, I must have overheard it somewhere," Miss Marple said vaguely. "My memory isn't what it was." Clara hesitated. "It's true. I did take tea out to Mr. Thornfield around 4 o'clock. He was with a lady, but I didn't see her face properly. She was wearing one of those big sun hats, sitting with her back to me." "I see," said Miss Marple thoughtfully. "And did you mention this to Inspector Craddock?" "Yes, miss, but I couldn't tell him who she was." Clara bit her lip. "Do you think it's important?" "Everything is potentially important in matters like these," Miss Marple replied. "Thank you, Clara. You've been most helpful." As Miss Marple walked home through the village, her mind was busy organizing the facts she had gathered. The timeline was beginning to take shape in her head, and with it, certain possibilities. But she needed more. More observations, more connections, more of the seemingly trivial details that so often pointed to the truth. And if her suspicions were correct, she needed to tread very carefully indeed. For she was beginning to believe that Edgar Thornfield's death was not an isolated crime, but the culmination of something set in motion years ago, with the controversial Melford case at its heart. Chapter 4. The Obvious Suspect. The inquest into Edgar Thornfield's death was held on Thursday morning in the village hall. Miss Marple arrived early, settling herself inconspicuously in the back row. She watched as the room gradually filled with villagers, some drawn by genuine concern, others by the irresistible allure of local drama. Sir Richard and Lady Philippa Lacey entered together, his face impassive, hers partially obscured by a stylish hat with a small veil. They took seats in the front row, exchanging no words. Dr. Haydock arrived shortly after, nodding briefly to Miss Marple as he passed. His normally confident demeanor seemed subdued. The proceedings themselves were brief and largely formal. The coroner, Mr. Graves, established the basic facts. Edgar Thornfield, 52, had died from a single wound to the heart, inflicted by a narrow-bladed instrument that had not been recovered. The time of death was estimated between 5:30 and 5:45 p.m. Clara Jenkins testified to finding the body. Dr. Haydock confirmed his immediate assessment that nothing could be done for the victim. Inspector Craddock then took the stand to report on. the investigation thus far. His testimony revealed several new details. The deceased was not, as he had claimed, a historian researching Tudor architecture, Craddock stated. His real name was Edward Thomas, a freelance journalist known for investigating miscarriages of justice. Among his possessions we found extensive notes on the Melford poison case of 1945, in which Dr. Gerald Melford was convicted of murdering his wife. A murmur ran through the audience. Sir Richard sat perfectly still, while Lady Philippa's gloved hand moved to rest on his arm. We also discovered, Craddock continued, that Mr. Thomas had contacted several individuals connected to the Melford case, including former witnesses and the prosecutor. His notes suggest he believed the conviction was unsafe and was preparing an article arguing for posthumous exoneration of Dr. Melford. Miss Marple's gaze shifted to Dr. Haydock, whose expression remained carefully neutral, though his knuckles were white where he gripped his hat. After hearing all testimony, the coroner returned a verdict of murder by person or persons unknown, and the inquest was adjourned. As the assembly dispersed, Miss Marple observed Inspector Craddock approaching Dr. Haydock with determined strides. Dr. Haydock, I'd appreciate if you'd accompany me to the police station. There are some additional questions I'd like to ask. Toothy phew, Doctor straightened his shoulders. Of course, Inspector. Though I've told you everything I know. Perhaps, said Craddock. But we've received new information regarding your connection to the Melford case that requires clarification. As they left, Miss Marple found herself walking alongside Mr. Petherick, the elderly solicitor. Most unfortunate business, Mr. Petherick commented. I fear our good doctor is in a rather difficult position. You think Inspector Craddock suspects him? Miss Marple inquired. It appears likely. The motive seems clear enough. If this Thomas Athesiu was about to publish something that vindicated Melford, it could cast aspersions on those who testified against him. He adjusted his spectacles. I understand Dr. Haydock wrote a paper challenging the toxicological evidence, but later withdrew it under pressure. Not something he'd want brought to light again, perhaps. I see, murmured Miss Marple. And the opportunity was certainly there. Precisely. Several witnesses place him near the courtyard around the critical time, and he admits himself that he left Lady Philippa shortly after the music changed. Mr. Petherick sighed. Such a shame. He's been an excellent physician for the village. Missy, Marple nodded thoughtfully. Do you happen to know, Mr. Petherick, if Sir Richard keeps any antique weapons at his home? A stiletto, perhaps? As a matter of fact, he does, the solicitor replied, surprised. Quite a collection, I'm told. Military daggers, ceremonial swords, that sort of thing. I drew up the insurance documents for them when he moved here. He gave her a curious look. Why do you ask? Just an old woman's idle curiosity, Miss Marple said with a smile. One hears so many village rumors. That afternoon, Miss Marple invited her friend, Inspector Craddock's aunt, Miss Weatherby, for tea. Between cherry cake and reminiscences about mutual acquaintances, she managed to extract what the village was already whispering. Dr. Haydock had been formally questioned as a suspect in Thornfield's, or rather Thomas's, murder. Dermot doesn't tell me anything official, of course, Miss Weatherby said, referring to her nephew by his first name. But I gather they found a letter in Thomas's room that changes everything. A letter? Miss Marple prompted. Yes. Apparently Thomas had written to Dr. Haydock before arriving in St. Mary Mead, revealing his investigation and requesting a meeting. The letter suggests the doctor had information that could prove Melford's innocence, information he had suppressed during the original trial. How very significant, murmured Miss Marple. Indeed, and there's more. The murder weapon may have been found. Miss Weatherby leaned forward conspiratorially. A letter opener, discovered in a flower bed near the courtyard, with the doctor's fingerprints on it. Miss Marple's eyebrows rose. That does seem rather conclusive. Dermot expects to make an arrest by tomorrow. Such a terrible thing for our village. After Miss Weatherby departed, Miss Marple sat in her garden, her needles clicking rhythmically as she sorted through the facts. Something wasn't quite right. The case against Dr. Haydock seemed almost too perfect, like a neatly wrapped package, and, in her experience, murder was seldom so tidy. Her reflections were interrupted by a quiet voice. "Miss Marple? Might I have a word?" She looked up to find Clara Jenkins standing nervously at her garden gate, glancing over her shoulder as though afraid of being observed. "Of course, my dear. Come in and sit down." The girl entered, twisting her hands anxiously. "I've remembered something, Miss Marple. Something about the day of the murder. About the lady in the courtyard with Mr. Thornfield. I didn't tell the police because I was scared, but I think I know who she was." Chapter 5. A Hidden Clue. "Please, sit down, Clara." Miss Marple gestured to the garden chair opposite her own. "Take your time." The young maid perched on the edge of the seat, still twisting her handkerchief nervously. "It's about the lady who was with Mr. Thornfield. Or Mr. Thomas, I should say. I told you I couldn't see her face properly because of the hat, but there was something familiar about her." "And you've remembered what it was?" Miss Marple prompted gently. Clara nodded. It was her perfume, very distinctive, like roses, but with something else, almost spicy. "And when I was clearing away the tea things after everyone had gone yesterday, I smelled it again in the drawing room at Gossington Hall." "On one of the guests?" "No, miss. On Lady Philippa Lacey. She'd left her scarf behind. And when Mrs. Bantry asked me to fold it, I recognized the scent immediately." Clara's voice dropped to a whisper. "Do you think I should tell Inspector Craddock?" Miss Marple considered this carefully. "It would be the proper thing to do. But I understand your hesitation. Sir Richard is a powerful man." "It's not just that," Clara admitted. "The thing is, I wasn't supposed to be in the courtyard at all that afternoon. Mrs. Wilson, that's the housekeeper, had told me to stay in the kitchen, but I saw Mr. Thornfield go out there from the window, and I was curious." She flushed. "He was ever so handsome, and he'd been kind to me earlier, asking about the old families in the village." "So you took it upon yourself to bring him tea?" Miss Marple suggested. "Yes. Mrs. Wilson was furious when she found out. Said I'd be sacked if I did anything like that again." Clara twisted her handkerchief tighter. "If I tell the police I recognized Lady Philippa's perfume, I'll have to admit I disobeyed orders. I might lose my position." "I see," murmured Miss Marple. "Tell me, Clara, did Mr. Thornfield and the lady seem to be arguing when you brought the tea?" Clara hesitated. "Not exactly arguing, but it wasn't friendly either. Very intense, like. She was leaning forward, speaking quickly and quietly. He was making notes in a little book." "How interesting," Miss Marple said. "And did you notice anything else? Anything at all, no matter how trivial it might seem?" The girl frowned in concentration. "Well, there was one odd thing. When I set down the tray, I noticed a photograph on the table between them. It looked like it had been cut from a newspaper or magazine. I only caught a glimpse, but I'm almost certain it was a wedding picture. A bride and groom." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused momentarily. "I see. That is interesting indeed." After Clara had gone, promising to think about whether to speak to Inspector Craddock, Miss Marple sat for a long while, her knitting forgotten in her lap. The pieces were beginning to form a pattern, but there were still gaps, crucial missing elements that prevented her from seeing the complete picture. She was roused from her reverie by the arrival of Colonel Bantry, looking harried as he opened her garden gate. "Miss Marple, I hoped I'd find you at home. The most extraordinary thing has happened." "Do come in, Colonel. You look as though you could use a cup of tea." "No time for that, I'm afraid. Haydock's been arrested," Colonel Bantry announced, settling heavily into the chair Clara had vacated. "They took him from his surgery not an hour ago." "On what grounds?" Miss Marple inquired, though she had already guessed the answer. "Murder, of course. Craddock seems convinced he's got his man." They found the letter opener in one of Dolly's flower beds, wiped clean except for Haydock's thumbprint. And there's some letter Thomas wrote to him, apparently quite damning. "I had heard something to that effect," Miss Marple admitted, "though it all seems rather convenient." Colonel Bantry looked at her sharply. "What do you mean by that?" "Simply that in my experience, murderers rarely leave such obvious evidence behind, especially intelligent ones." "You think Haydock's been framed?" Colonel Bantry leaned forward, intrigued. "I wouldn't go so far as to say that," Miss Marple replied cautiously, "but I do find myself wondering about certain aspects of the case. For instance, why would Dr. Haydock use his own letter opener as a murder weapon? And if he had information that could exonerate Dr. Melford, why wait until Thomas contacted him to reveal it?" "Perhaps he was protecting someone," suggested Colonel Bantry. "Or himself." "Perhaps," Miss Marple agreed. "Tell me, Colonel, do you recall exactly when you saw Dr. Haydock during the garden party? Particularly around the time the music changed." Colonel Bantry rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "Let me think. Yes, I believe he was with Sir Richard near the rose garden. They seemed to be having quite an intense conversation. I remember because I wanted to ask Richard about joining the golf club committee, but they looked so serious I decided to wait." "And this was when the quartet finished the Vivaldi?" "Just after, I'd say. The musicians were shuffling their sheet music." Miss Marple nodded, filing away this information. "One more thing, Colonel. I understand Lady Philippa introduced Mr. Thornfield, or Thomas, to Mrs. Bantry initially. Do you know how they became acquainted?" "At the Blue Boar, I believe. Pure coincidence. They happened to be taking tea at the same time." Colonel Bantry stood up. "I should be getting back. Dolly's in quite a state about the whole affair. First a murder at our garden party, and now a man we've known for years accused of it. Most unsettling." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed. "Please give Mrs. Bantry my regards." After Colonel Bantry had gone, Miss Marple reached for her knitting basket. But instead of her current project, she withdrew a small notebook. In it, she began to make careful notes, organizing the facts as she knew them, with particular attention to the timing of events and the movements of the key players. Something Colonel Bantry had said struck her as significant, not for what it revealed, but for what it contradicted. If Dr. Haydock was with Sir Richard when the music changed, he could not have been slipping away to murder Thomas in the courtyard at that exact moment. Yet the letter opener with his fingerprint suggested otherwise. Miss Marple tapped her pencil against the notebook. The answer, she was becoming increasingly certain, lay in the Melford case. But to understand exactly how, she would need to learn more about it, and about the people whose lives had been touched by it. She glanced at the clock. It was nearly time for her weekly visit to the lending library. Perhaps Miss Hartnell, who kept old newspapers dating back decades, might be persuaded to lend her some from 1945. Chapter 6. Confrontations and Secrets. The village lending library occupied a small room in the parish hall, its shelves crammed with well-thumbed novels and outdated reference books. Miss Hartnell presided over it with the zealous authority of a self-appointed guardian of literature. "Newspapers from 1945?" she repeated when Miss Marple made her request. "Whatever for, Jane?" "Just a little historical research," Miss Marple replied vaguely. "I was reminiscing about those post-war years and realized how much I've forgotten." Miss Hartnell looked skeptical, but led the way to a back room where stacks of yellowing newspapers were bundled with twine. "They're not catalogued properly, I'm afraid. You'll have to search through them yourself." "Thank you. I don't mind at all," Miss Marple assured her. For the next hour, she carefully examined the brittle pages, scanning for any mention of the Melford case. Finally, in a Daily Telegraph from August 1945, she found what she was looking for: a report on the trial of Dr. Gerald Melford, accused of poisoning his wealthy wife, Caroline. The article outlined the prosecution's case. Caroline Melford had died of arsenic poisoning. The poison had been administered gradually over several weeks, disguised in her medicine. As her primary physician, Dr. Melford had exclusive control over her medication. The motive, according to the prosecution, was financial. Caroline had inherited a substantial fortune from her first husband, and Gerald stood to inherit everything upon her death. Miss Marple noted with interest that the prosecutor in the case was one Anthony Hargreaves, K.C., described as brilliant and relentless. Among the key witnesses were the Melfords' housekeeper, who testified that the doctor often prepared his wife's medicine personally, and a young nurse who had been assisting with Caroline's care. The nurse's testimony seemed particularly damning. She had observed Dr. Melford adding a substance to his wife's medication that wasn't part of her prescribed treatment. When questioned, he had explained it was a harmless supplement to help with absorption. Miss Marple carefully copied the nurse's name into her notebook: Philippa Lawson. Further searching revealed a small announcement from the following year: the engagement of Sir Richard Lacey, distinguished judge, to Miss Philippa Lawson, described as a medical professional. The announcement mentioned that Sir Richard had recently lost his wife to illness. Miss Marple sat back, her eyes narrowed in thought. The connection was clear now. Lady Philippa had been a witness in the Melford case, a case over which her future husband had presided as judge. And now, years later, a journalist investigating that same case had been murdered shortly after meeting with her. As Miss Marple left the library, she nearly collided with Mr. Petherick on the steps. "Ah, Miss Marple. Just the person I was hoping to see." The elderly solicitor looked uncharacteristically agitated. "I've just come from visiting Dr. Haydock at the police station. He asked specifically if I would speak with you." "With me?" Miss Marple affected surprise. "How unusual. I hope the poor man is holding up well." "As well as can be expected. He maintains his innocence, of course." Mr. Petherick lowered his voice. "He mentioned something rather curious that he thought might interest you. Apparently, the night before the garden party, he received an anonymous note." "What did it say?" Miss Marple asked. "That's just it. He wouldn't tell me the exact contents. Said it was too dangerous. But he did say it concerned the Melford case, and suggested that he meet with Thomas at Mrs. Bantry's party to discuss what he knew." Mr. Petherick adjusted his spectacles. "The curious thing is, he claims he never actually had that meeting. He was planning to speak with Thomas privately, but by the time he could disengage himself from Lady Philippa, it was too late." "I see," murmured Miss Marple. "That is interesting indeed." "There's one more thing," the solicitor added. "Dr. Haydock asked if you would speak with Clara Jenkins again. He seemed to think she might have information that could help clear his name." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "I shall certainly try, though I'm not sure what an old woman like myself can accomplish that the police cannot. He has great faith in your discernment, Mr. Petherick said diplomatically. As do I, if I may say so. They parted ways, and Miss Marple decided to take a slightly circuitous route home, one that would pass by the Lacey's residence, a handsome Georgian house set back from the main road. As she approached, she noticed Lady Philippa in the front garden, cutting roses for what appeared to be a substantial arrangement. "Good afternoon, Lady Philippa," Miss Marple called, pausing at the gate. "What beautiful roses! The crimson ones are particularly striking." Lady Philippa glanced up, scissors poised in mid-air. "Miss Marple, isn't it?" "Yes, they do well in this soil. I'm cutting some for the church." "How thoughtful," Miss Marple remarked. "I've always found flower arranging so soothing in times of stress. And recent events must have been quite stressful for you and Sir Richard." A guarded look crossed Lady Philippa's face. "Yes, well, one carries on." "Indeed one does," Miss Marple agreed. "I understand Dr. Haydock has been arrested. Such a shock for the village. He's been so well respected." "The evidence seems quite convincing," Lady Philippa said coolly. "Though, of course, one shouldn't prejudge." "Quite right," Miss Marple nodded. "Justice must take its course, as Sir Richard would no doubt agree. Much as it did in the Melford case, though I understand there were some questions raised about that verdict later on." Lady Philippa's scissors snipped sharply, severing a rose, stem with unnecessary force. "I'm not sure what you mean." "Oh, just village gossip, I'm sure," Miss Marple said vaguely. "One hears so many things. For instance, I heard that Mr. Thomas, or Thornfield, as we knew him, was investigating that very case. Such a coincidence that he should come to St. Taitai Mary Mead, where both you and Dr. Haydock now reside." Lady Philippa's composure faltered briefly. "If you'll excuse me, Miss Marple, I really must finish these arrangements before the light fades." "Of course," Miss Marple smiled. "Please don't let me keep you. Though I did want to ask, that lovely perfume you're wearing, is it Rose de Nuit? My niece gave me a similar scent last Christmas, though I fear it was rather wasted on an old woman. Like me." Lady Philippa's face had gone very still. "It's a French perfume, quite exclusive." "How lovely," Miss Marple murmured. "Well, good afternoon to you." As she continued her walk home, Miss Marple's mind was racing. Lady Philippa's reaction confirmed what Clara had told her. She had indeed met with Thomas in the courtyard. But why? And what was in the anonymous note that Dr. Haydock had received? The answers, Miss Marple felt certain, were hidden in the events of 1945 and the trial that had sent an innocent man to his death. What she needed now was to understand exactly what Thomas had discovered and why that discovery had cost him his life. Chapter 7. Another twist the following morning, Miss Marple was pruning her hydrangeas when she heard the garden gate click open. Looking up, she was surprised to see Inspector Craddock approaching along the path. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said, removing his hat. "I hope I'm not disturbing you too early." "Not at all, Inspector. I'm always up with the birds these days. Age has its habits." She set her gardening shears aside. "Would you care for some tea?" "Thank you, but I'm here on official business, I'm afraid." Craddock looked uncharacteristically troubled. "Mr. Petherick mentioned you might have spoken with Clara Jenkins recently." "Yes, the poor girl came to see me yesterday." Miss Marple led the way to her garden chairs. "She was quite upset. Did she happen to mention anything about Lady Philippa Lacey?" Miss Marple considered her answer carefully. "She did observe something that concerned her. I suggested she should speak with you directly." Craddock sighed. "That's just it. Clara Jenkins has disappeared." "Disappeared?" Miss Marple echoed, genuine alarm in her voice. She didn't report for work at Gossington Hall this morning. Mrs. Wilson went to her cottage and found it empty. Bed not slept in, no note left behind. Her mother hasn't seen her since yesterday afternoon. Craddock's expression was grave. "She was last seen leaving the village shop around 4 o'clock. "After she visited me," Miss Marple murmured. "What exactly did she tell you?" Craddock asked. Miss Marple related Clara's observations about Lady Philippa's distinctive perfume and the meeting in the courtyard, as well as the wedding photograph she had glimpsed. Craddock listened attentively, making notes. "This changes things considerably," he said when she had finished. "We've been proceeding on the assumption that Dr. Haydock was our man. But if Lady Philippa met with Thomas earlier that day—" "It raises questions," Miss Marple agreed, particularly in light of her connection to the Melford case. Craddock looked sharply at her. "You know about that?" "I did a little research at the lending library yesterday," she admitted. "The newspapers from 1945 were most informative. Lady Philippa, then Nurse Lawson, was a key witness against Dr. Melford." "Yes, we've established that connection as well," Craddock said. "Though Sir Richard claims he didn't realize who Thomas was until after the murder, when we found the journalist's notes." "And now Clara has vanished," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "Inspector, I fear the girl may be in danger. If she witnessed something important—" "We're searching for her," Craddock assured her. "Every available constable is on it." "But I have to ask, Miss Marple, did she mention anything else? Anything at all that might help us find her?" Miss Marple considered the question. She was very concerned about her position. Apparently, she wasn't supposed to be in the courtyard at all that day. Mrs. Wilson had forbidden it. "Mrs. Wilson?" Craddock repeated, his brow furrowing. "The housekeeper at Gossington Hall. According to Clara, she was quite stern about it." "I see." Craddock stood up. "I should speak with Mrs. Wilson again, and I'll need to question Lady Philippa about this meeting." "Please be careful, Inspector," Miss Marple cautioned. "If Clara's disappearance is connected to what she saw—" "Don't worry, I'll be discreet." Craddock replaced his hat. "Thank you for your help, Miss Marple. As always, your observations prove invaluable." After the inspector had gone, Miss Marple remained in her garden, deeply troubled. Clara's disappearance suggested that the stakes in this case were even higher than she had imagined. The girl had mentioned the wedding photograph shown during the meeting between Thomas and Lady Philippa. Could that be the key to understanding what the journalist had discovered? Her reflections were interrupted by the telephone ringing inside the cottage. It was Colonel Bantry, sounding agitated. "Miss Marple, have you heard? Clara Jenkins has gone missing, and now there's been a break-in at Haydock's surgery." "A break-in? When?" "Must have been overnight. His nurse arrived this morning to find the place ransacked. Filing cabinets broken into, papers everywhere. The police are there now." "Was anything taken?" Miss Marple asked. "That's just it. Nobody knows exactly. Dr. Haydock is still in custody, and his nurse isn't sure what to look for. But it's a devilish coincidence, don't you think?" "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed. "Colonel, would it be possible for you to drive me to Dr. Haydock's surgery? I believe Inspector Craddock might benefit from another perspective." 20 minutes later, Colonel Bantry's car pulled up outside the modest building that housed Dr. Haydock's medical practice. Several police vehicles were parked outside, and a constable stood guard at the door. Inspector Craddock looked up in surprise as Miss Marple entered, supported by Colonel Bantry's arm. "Miss Marple, this is most irregular." "I apologize for the intrusion, Inspector," she replied. But when Colonel Bantry mentioned the break-in, I wondered if it might be connected to something Dr. Haydock said to Mr. Petherick. Craddock's interest was piqued. Go on. Dr. Haydock mentioned receiving an anonymous note the night before the garden party. I believe he might have kept it here, among his personal papers. We've found no such note, Craddock said. Perhaps that's what the intruder was looking for, Miss Marple suggested. She surveyed the disorder of the surgery. Drawers pulled out, contents scattered across the floor, medical files spilled from cabinets. But something about the scene struck her as odd. Inspector, was the door forced? She inquired. No, Craddock admitted. Whoever did this had a key, or knew where one was kept. Miss Marple nodded, as if this confirmed something in her mind. And the filing cabinets. Which ones were targeted? Particularly, the inspector pointed to a tall cabinet in the corner. That one was emptied completely. Old records, from what the nurse tells us, going back 15 years or more. How interesting, murmured Miss Marple. Around the time of the Melford case, in fact. She moved carefully through the ransacked office, her eyes taking in every detail. On the doctor's desk, she noticed a framed photograph. A group of young medical students in white coats, standing outside a hospital. Is Dr. Haydock in this picture? She asked. Inspector Craddock came to stand beside her. Yes, that's him there. He pointed to a young, smiling Haydock. In the back row, Miss Marple studied the photograph carefully, then pointed to another figure. And who is that young man, standing next to him? Craddock squinted at the faded image. I couldn't say. One of his fellow students, presumably. I believe, Miss Marple said quietly, that it may be Dr. Gerald Melford. The inspector stared at her, then back at the photograph. You're suggesting they knew each other before the trial? But Haydock never mentioned. He was interrupted by a constable who burst into the room breathing hard. Inspector, we've found something at the old Priory ruins. You'd better come quickly, sir. What is it? Craddock demanded. The constable's face was grim. A body, sir. Female. Young. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly, a prayer on her lips for poor Clara Jenkins. Chapter 8. Miss Marple's final test, the body discovered at the Priory ruins, was indeed that of Clara Jenkins. Miss Marple, waiting at Dr. Haydock's surgery while Colonel Bantry drove Inspector Craddock to the scene, received the grim confirmation an hour later. Strangled. From the preliminary examination, Craddock reported grimly when he returned. Probably last evening, not long after she left your cottage. The poor, poor girl, Miss Marple murmured, her eyes troubled. I should have advised her. To speak with you immediately, Inspector. I never imagined— You couldn't have known, Craddock assured her. None of us anticipated this level of desperation. Miss Marple nodded, though the guilt still weighed heavily. Have you questioned Lady Philippa about her meeting with Thomas? Sir Richard claims they were both at home all evening. Gardiner confirms they were there until at least 5 o'clock, when he finished his work. I see, said Miss Marple thoughtfully. And Mrs. Wilson? Clara mentioned she had been particularly insistent about keeping her away from the courtyard on the day of the party. Mrs. Wilson, Craddock said slowly, appears to have taken a sudden leave of absence. According to Mrs. Bantry, she requested personal time this morning, a family emergency in Devon. How very convenient, Miss Marple remarked. Indeed, we're trying to locate her, but she seems to have disappeared as effectively as Clara did. Craddock ran a hand through his hair in frustration. What's more, we've now confirmed that the photograph in Dr. Haydock's office does show him with Gerald Melford. They weren't just colleagues. According to the hospital records we've obtained, they were close friends. Miss Marple absorbed this information with a slight nod. And yet, he never mentioned this connection. No. When confronted with the photograph, he admitted they were friends, but insisted it had no bearing on the current case. Craddock's expression was troubled. I'm beginning to wonder if our initial assessment was wrong. Haydock has been hiding things from us, and now with this connection to Melford. Inspector, Miss Marple said carefully, before you draw conclusions, there is something I believe you should consider. The timing of Thomas's murder still puzzles me. Colonel Bantry mentioned seeing Dr. Haydock with Sir Richard precisely when the murder must have occurred. Both cannot be true. Craddock frowned. Colonel Bantry might be mistaken about the exact time. Perhaps, but there is another possibility. Miss Marple hesitated. Inspector, I believe I may have a way to get to the truth, but I will need your cooperation. What do you have in mind? A small deception, Miss Marple admitted, and it would require Dr. Haydock's temporary release into custody. Craddock looked skeptical. That's highly irregular. On what grounds? On the grounds that I believe we have been pursuing the wrong person all along, Miss Marple said firmly, and that the real killer may strike again if we don't act quickly. After lengthy discussion, Craddock reluctantly agreed to Miss Marple's plan. By that evening, arrangements had been made. Dr. Haydock, under police supervision but ostensibly released for lack of evidence, would attend a small gathering at Miss Marple's cottage. The guest list was carefully selected. Colonel and Mrs. Bantry, Sir Richard and Lady Philippa Lacy, Mr. Petherick, and Miss Weatherby. I still don't understand what you hope to accomplish, Craddock said as they finalized the details. If the Lacys are involved, they're hardly going to confess over tea and cake. Sometimes, Miss Marple replied, people reveal more than they intend when caught off guard, and I believe our murderer has become overconfident after successfully eliminating Clara. The gathering was set for the following afternoon. Miss Marple spent the morning preparing, not only with the customary tea and cakes, but also by carefully arranging certain items in her sitting room: photographs, newspaper clippings, and a small notebook she had found among Dr. Haydock's scattered papers, overlooked by both the police and the intruder. The guests began to arrive at 3 o'clock. Colonel and Mrs. Bantry came first, followed by Mr. Petherick and Miss Weatherby. Sir Richard and Lady Philippa arrived precisely on time, Sir Richard looking stern and Lady Philippa elegant but tense. Dr. Haydock was the last to enter, accompanied by a plainclothes police officer who remained discreetly near the door. Thank you all for coming, Miss Marple said, as they settled into their seats. I know these have been distressing days for our village. 2 murders in such a short time is unprecedented in St. Mary Mead. Quite, agreed Sir Richard. Though, I must say, Miss Marple, I'm surprised to see Dr. Haydock here. I was under the impression he was indisposed. The police have been kind enough to allow him to attend, Miss Marple explained. You see, I believe I may have stumbled upon something important regarding Mr. Thomas's death, and poor Clara's as well. Lady Philippa shifted in her seat. What could you possibly have discovered that the police haven't? It's not so much a discovery as a realization, Miss Marple said, about the timing of events and about certain connections that have long been hidden. She moved to a small table where several items were arranged. For instance, this photograph from Dr. Haydock's office shows him with Dr. Gerald Melford during their medical training. They were friends, you see. Very good friends. That's hardly revelatory, Sir Richard said dismissively. Old associations mean little. Perhaps, Miss Marple conceded. But what is interesting is that Dr. Haydock testified for the defense at Dr. Melford's trial, a fact that was barely mentioned in the press reports. His testimony contradicted that of another witness, a nurse who claimed to have seen Dr. Melford tampering with his wife's medicine. All eyes turned to Lady Philippa, who sat very still. "That testimony was discredited," Sir Richard said firmly. "The jury found it unreliable." "As directed by the judge?" Miss Marple noted. "Yourself, Sir Richard." "Really, Miss Marple," Lady Philippa said with forced lightness, "are you suggesting some kind of conspiracy regarding a case from 20 years ago?" "Not a conspiracy, exactly," Miss Marple replied, "but I do believe that Thomas discovered something significant, perhaps evidence that would have exonerated Dr. Melford posthumously. And I believe Clara Jenkins saw something the day of the murder that made her a threat." She picked up a small notebook. This was among Dr. Haydock's papers. It contains notes about Caroline Melford's symptoms that Dr. Haydock believed were inconsistent with arsenic poisoning as presented by the prosecution. Dr. Haydock spoke for the first time. "Where did you find that? I thought it was lost years ago." "It had fallen behind one of your filing cabinets," Miss Marple explained. "But what's most interesting is what Clara told me before she died about seeing a wedding photograph during the meeting between Thomas and Lady Philippa." Chapter 9. The reveal of profound silence fell over the room at Miss Marple's mention of the wedding photograph. She observed each face carefully, noting the flicker of alarm in Lady Philippa's eyes and the almost imperceptible tightening of Sir Richard's jaw. "I fail to see the relevance of any wedding photograph," Sir Richard said at last, his judicial voice steady, but with an undertone of tension. "This entire gathering seems designed to cast aspersions without solid evidence." "On the contrary," Miss Marple replied mildly, "I believe the photograph is crucial to understanding why Thomas was killed, and why poor Clara had to die as well." She turned to Lady Philippa. "You met with Thomas in the courtyard at Gossington Hall hours before he was murdered. He showed you a wedding photograph that greatly disturbed you. Would you care to tell us what it was?" Lady Philippa's complexion had gone ashen. "I don't know what you're talking about. I never met with the man privately." "Clara Jenkins saw you," Miss Marple said simply. "She recognized your distinctive perfume when she brought tea to the courtyard. The same perfume I noticed when I spoke with you in your garden." "The maid was mistaken," Sir Richard interjected. "Many women wear similar scents." "Perhaps," Miss Marple conceded, "but there's something else." She turned to Dr. Haydock. "The anonymous note you received before the garden party. Do you recall exactly what it said?" Dr. Haydock hesitated, glancing at the police officer by the door. "It said that someone had found proof of Gerald Melford's innocence, and that I should meet with Edward Thomas at the garden party to discuss it. It was signed, 'A Friend Who Knows the Truth.'" "And did you arrange such a meeting?" Miss Marple asked. "No," Dr. Haydock replied. "I intended to speak with him, but by the time I could excuse myself from my conversation with Lady Philippa and Sir Richard, it was too late. Thomas was already dead." Miss Marple nodded. "Which brings us to a curious contradiction. Colonel Bantry saw you with Sir Richard at precisely the time when Thomas must have been killed. Yet the murder weapon bore your fingerprint." "A letter opener from my surgery," Dr. Haydock confirmed. "But I hadn't touched it in weeks. It was kept in a drawer in my desk." "A drawer to which many people might have access," Miss Marple suggested, "including other medical professionals who might visit your practice." Lady Philippa's hand trembled slightly as she set down her teacup. "This is absurd. You're insinuating that I somehow took James's letter opener and used it to kill Thomas? For what possible reason?" "To protect a secret," Miss Marple said quietly. "A secret from the past that Thomas had uncovered. one that threatened not only your reputation, but your very freedom. She turned to the assembled guests. You see, I believe Thomas discovered something about Caroline Melford's death that contradicted the official findings. Perhaps evidence that someone else had access to her medicine. Someone who might have had a motive to want her dead. Miss Marple's gaze returned to Lady Philippa. You were Caroline Melford's nurse before you testified against her husband. But I wonder if Thomas discovered an even earlier connection. The color had completely drained from Lady Philippa's face. Sir Richard placed a protective hand over hers. That's quite enough, Miss Marple. These insinuations border on slander. It's not slander if it's true, Sir Richard, Miss Marple replied firmly. And I believe the wedding photograph Thomas showed Lady Philippa provided the final proof he needed. She picked up a newspaper clipping from the table, a society page announcement. This is a report of Caroline Melford's first marriage to industrialist Henry Whittaker in 1932. The bride was attended by her cousin and closest friend, Philippa Lawson. The room went very still. You weren't just Caroline Melford's nurse, Miss Marple said to Lady Philippa. You were her cousin and confidant, a fact you concealed during the trial. Chapter 10. Aftermath. A week after Lady Philippa's arrest, St. Mary Mead had begun to return to its normal rhythms. The village still buzzed with discussions of the shocking events, but the fevered intensity had subsided, replaced by the usual, gentle pace of rural life. Miss Marple sat in her garden, enjoying the late afternoon sunshine. The dahlias were at their best now, their vibrant colors a cheerful contrast to the somber thoughts that had occupied her mind in recent days. The sound of the garden gate opening drew her attention, and she looked up to see Dr. Haydock approaching. Miss Marple, he greeted her, looking more rested than when she had last seen him. I hope I'm not disturbing you? Not at all, Dr. Haydock. Please, join me. She indicated the chair opposite. How are you settling back into your practice? As well as can be expected, he replied, taking a seat. There are some in the village who still look at me with suspicion. I'm afraid. Mud sticks, as they say. It will pass, Miss Marple assured him. People have short memories for such things, especially when the true culprit has been identified so decisively. Dr. Haydock nodded. I've come to thank you properly. Without your intervention, I might still be sitting in a cell awaiting trial. I merely observed what was there to be seen, Miss Marple said modestly. It was the inconsistency of timing that first alerted me. You couldn't have been with Sir Richard and killing Thomas simultaneously. Even so, your insight was remarkable. He hesitated. There's something I should have told you, and Inspector Craddock, from the beginning, about Gerald Melford. That you believed in his innocence? Miss Marple suggested. More than believed. I knew. Dr. Haydock's face was troubled. Caroline Melford's symptoms were never consistent with arsenic poisoning as the prosecution claimed. I testified to that effect, but Sir Richard's summing up to the jury effectively discounted my evidence in favor of the more dramatic testimony from Nurse Lawson, Lady Philippa. And you never suspected she might have been responsible? Dr. Haydock shook his head. Not until Thomas contacted me. His letter mentioned new evidence suggesting that Caroline had been poisoned, but by a different substance altogether. One that would have required medical knowledge to administer. Digitalis, perhaps? Miss Marple suggested. From foxglove, plants. The symptoms can resemble arsenic in some ways, but the substance breaks down quickly in the body. Dr. Haydock looked at her in surprise. That's exactly what Thomas suspected. How did you know? There was a passage in your notebook about cardiac symptoms that seemed inconsistent with arsenic, Miss Marple explained. And foxgloves grow abundantly in this part of England. A nurse would certainly know their properties. Yes, and the tests available in 1945 wouldn't have detected it accurately after death. Dr. Haydock sighed heavily. If only I had pursued my doubts more vigorously at the time, Gerald might still be alive. You mustn't blame yourself, Miss Marple said gently. You did testify to your concerns after all. It was the court that chose not to give them proper weight. Thanks in no small part to Sir Richard's influence, Dr. Haydock noted. I wonder if he ever suspected the truth about his wife. I believe not, Miss Marple replied. His shock seemed genuine when Lady Philippa confessed. I think he was as deceived as everyone else. He's left the village, you know, Dr. Haydock informed her. Sold the house to a family from London. No one has seen him since the day after the arrest. That's probably for the best, Miss Marple observed. Too many painful associations. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, watching a robin hop among the flower beds. Then Dr. Haydock spoke again. There's one thing I still don't understand. How did you know about the wedding photograph? Clara mentioned it to you, but how did you guess its significance? When I learned that Lady Philippa had been Caroline Melford's cousin, it seemed likely that she would have been in her wedding photographs, Miss Marple explained. Thomas must have discovered their relationship and confronted Lady Philippa with the evidence. It was the final piece he needed to connect her to the original crime. And Mrs. Wilson? Was she involved as well? I believe she was an unwitting accomplice, Miss Marple said. Lady Philippa likely suggested to her that Clara had been behaving inappropriately, perhaps flirting with male guests, and should be kept away from the courtyard. Mrs. Wilson would have had no reason to question such a directive from someone of Lady Philippa's standing. And her sudden departure? Fear, most likely. When Clara disappeared, Mrs. Wilson may have realized she had inadvertently played a part in something sinister. She fled rather than face questioning. Miss Marple's expression grew thoughtful. Inspector Craddock mentioned. They've located her in Devon. She's cooperating fully with the investigation now. Dr. Haydock nodded. I suppose that ties up all the loose ends. Nearly all, Miss Marple agreed. Though I still wonder about one thing. Sir Richard presided over the Melford case, and his summing up was instrumental in securing the conviction. Years later, he married the key witness, a woman who stood to gain financially from that very conviction. You think he might have been complicit after all? Not necessarily, Miss Marple said carefully. But one does wonder if, on some level, his judgment was affected by his feelings for the witness. The heart can blind us to truths our minds might otherwise perceive. A failing we're all vulnerable to, I suppose, Dr. Haydock observed. Indeed. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to her garden, where the first fallen leaves of autumn had begun to appear among the flowers. Human nature remains consistent, Dr. Haydock. Passion, greed, fear, they motivate people in the same ways, whether in London society or our little village. And you've made quite a study of it, he remarked with a smile. One observes, she said simply. Living in a village for so many years, one sees the same patterns repeated. Lady Philippa reminded me of Elsie Matthews from the haberdashery. Lovely to look at, charming in manner, but with a coldness at her core and a willingness to sacrifice others for her own advancement. Dr. Haydock rose to leave. I should be getting back to the surgery. There's still much to set in order after the break-in. Of course, Miss Marple said. I'm glad to see you resuming your normal life, Doctor. As she watched him walk down the garden path, Miss Marple reflected on the tragic sequence of events that had begun so many years ago with Caroline Melford's death. and culminated in the Courtyard at Gossington Hall. A clever murder followed by a second, more desperate one, a life built on deception, maintained through charm and calculation, until the past finally caught up with its architect. The case was closed, justice had been served, and St. Mary Mead would soon return to its peaceful existence. But Miss Marple knew that beneath the tranquil surface of village life, human passions continued to simmer, and sooner or later they would boil over once again, bringing new mysteries to her door. She picked up her knitting with a small sigh, her needles clicking rhythmically as the shadows lengthened across her garden. Chapter 11. Echoes from the past a month had passed since Lady Philippa's dramatic confession. The villagers of St. Mary Mead had weathered the subsequent trial with a mixture of morbid fascination and collective embarrassment that such darkness had lurked among them undetected. Miss Marple had kept largely to herself during this period, avoiding the gossip that swirled through the village. On this particular morning, the postman delivered a letter bearing a London postmark. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the contents proved to be of considerable interest. "Jane, you simply must read this," Mrs. Bantry declared later that afternoon during their weekly tea. "The Evening Chronicle is publishing a series on miscarriages of justice, focusing on the Melford case. They're saying there's to be a formal review of the original trial." "Yes, I received a letter this morning from Mr. Thomas's editor, Miss E.P.C.," Marple replied. It seems he had sent a substantial file of research to his London office the day before the garden party. "Have you heard that Dr. Haydock received a letter from Sir Richard?" Mrs. Bantry asked. "No, I hadn't. What did it contain?" "An apology of sorts. Sir Richard wrote that he had reviewed his notes from the Melford trial and realized that he had, perhaps unconsciously, given undue weight to Philippa's testimony." Mrs. Bantry lowered her voice. "He admitted that he had been taken with her." "Even then, that doesn't surprise me," Miss Marple remarked. "The heart's influence on the mind is often underestimated, especially by those who pride themselves on their logical thinking." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Martha, Miss Marple's maid, entered with an apologetic expression. "I'm sorry to disturb you, miss, but there's a young woman asking to see you. Says she's Miss Catherine Melford." A startled silence fell over the room. Mrs. Bantry's cup rattled slightly against its saucer. "Gerald Melford's daughter," Miss Marple said quietly. "Please show her in." The woman who entered was in her late 20s, with a quiet dignity. She was simply but elegantly dressed, with dark hair drawn back from a face that bore unmistakable signs of recent strain. "Miss Marple, I'm Catherine Melford." Her voice was cultured, but held a hint of nervousness. "I've come about the recent developments, Lady Philippa's arrest, and the revelations about my father's case. It must have been quite a shock." "Miss," Marple said gently, "yes and no. I've spent my life believing in my father's innocence." Catherine's expression was complex. "After his conviction, I was sent to live with my mother's family, my biological mother, who had died when I was an infant. They never spoke of my father. It was as if that part of my life had been erased. And now the truth has emerged at last. Partly, thanks to you," Catherine acknowledged. "The police say Lady Philippa admitted poisoning Caroline and framing my father." She hesitated, then reached into her handbag and withdrew an envelope. "I found this among my aunt's papers after she died. Last year. It's what prompted me to engage Mr. Thomas to investigate." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose. "You hired Mr. Thomas?" "Yes. He had a reputation for investigating miscarriages of justice." Catherine leaned forward. "The letter inside is from Philippa. 'Lawson to my aunt. written shortly after my father's conviction. With careful fingers, Miss Marple extracted a yellowed sheet of paper. As she read, her expression remained impassive, but Mrs. Bantry detected a slight widening of her eyes. Lady Philippa essentially admits her role in Caroline's death, though in veiled terms, Miss Marple said, refolding the letter. She speaks of our arrangement and the plan we discussed, having succeeded beyond expectations. And she mentions a division of the inheritance. Catherine nodded grimly. My aunt never came forward with it. I believe she was ashamed of her involvement, however peripheral. You mean there was a conspiracy? Mrs. Bantry gasped. This letter certainly suggests a level of prior knowledge on your aunt's part, Miss Marple said thoughtfully. But people can be complicit in dreadful events without fully understanding what they're enabling. The letter also mentions the old woman who knows too much, Catherine added. Philippa writes that she must be handled with care. Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly. I believe I may know who she was referring to. There was an elderly nurse, Martha Bellamy, who had worked at the Melford house. She had expressed concerns about Caroline's symptoms, suggesting they resembled digitalis poisoning rather than arsenic. What happened to her? Mrs. Bantry asked. She died about a year after the trial. Natural causes, ostensibly. She was in her 70s, but the timing is certainly interesting in light of this letter. Catherine's face had gone pale. You think Lady Philippa might have... When someone has committed one murder successfully, Miss Marple said carefully, a second becomes considerably easier, especially if it can be disguised as natural death in an elderly person. I never imagined the depth of deception involved, Catherine said quietly, or how many lives were destroyed by it. Evil casts long shadows, Miss Marple observed, but truth, however delayed, brings its own kind of healing. Later, after her visitors had departed, Miss Marple sat in her garden as twilight descended. Her thoughts turned to Martha Bellamy, whose suspicious death had gone unquestioned. How many other secrets still lay buried in St. Mary Mead's peaceful soil? The Melford case would be reviewed, Gerald's name posthumously cleared. But Martha Bellamy's death would likely remain classified as natural. One more loose end neatly, tied by a woman who had almost gotten away with everything. Almost, but not quite. Miss Marple sighed softly, rising as the evening chill deepened. One couldn't rectify every injustice or expose every lie, but one could observe, remember, and, when the moment came, speak the truth as one saw it. That, at least, she had done. Chapter 12. Full circle, spring had returned to St. Mary Mead, bringing with it a freshness that seemed to cleanse the village of the darkness that had shadowed it through the winter months. Miss Marple's garden bloomed with daffodils and early tulips, their bright colors a welcome change from the monochrome palette of the colder season. She was tending to her prized hyacinths when Dr. Haydock appeared at her garden gate, newspaper tucked under his arm, and a look of satisfaction on his face. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he called. "I thought you might like to see this." She straightened carefully, one hand pressed against her back. "Good morning, Doctor. What news do you bring?" "The official exoneration," he replied, extending the newspaper as he approached. "Gerald Melford's name has been cleared at last. The Ministry of Justice has issued a formal apology for the miscarriage of justice." Miss Marple accepted the paper, scanning the headline. "Doctor wrongfully executed. Government admits grave error in Melford case." "How gratifying," she murmured, though rather late for poor Dr. Melford himself. Indeed. Dr. Haydock's expression was complex, satisfaction mingled with lingering sadness. "But it means a great deal to Catherine. She telephoned this morning to tell me the news." "You've kept in touch with her, then?" Miss Marple inquired, returning to her gardening chair and gesturing for the doctor to join her. "Yes, we've corresponded. Regularly since her visit." He settled into the adjacent seat. "She's been remarkably resilient throughout the review process. I understand she's planning to establish a foundation in her father's name, something to assist families of those wrongfully convicted. A fitting memorial," Miss Marple observed. "Have there been any further developments regarding Lady Philippa's case?" Dr. Haydock nodded grimly. "She's been sentenced to life imprisonment. No chance of parole for at least 20 years. Sir Richard was present at the sentencing but left immediately afterward. Rumor has it he's moved abroad. Switzerland, I believe. A sad end to what appeared to be a distinguished career," Miss Marple said, "though I suppose his reputation was hardly untarnished by the revelation of his role in the Melford case." "The review was quite damning in its assessment of his conduct during the trial," Dr. Haydock confirmed. "While they stopped short of alleging deliberate misconduct, they were clear that his summing up to the jury showed unconscionable bias against the defense." Miss Marple's needles clicked rhythmically as she began to knit, a habit that helped her think. "And what of Martha Bellamy? Was her death examined as part of the review?" "Unfortunately, no. Too much time has passed, and her body was cremated." Dr. Haydock sighed. "But Catherine and I both believe Lady Philippa was responsible. The timing is simply too convenient." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, the only sound the gentle click of Miss Marple's knitting needles and the distant call of birds from the vicarage garden. "Did I mention," Dr. Haydock said finally, "that Inspector Craddock has been promoted? Chief Inspector now, largely due to his handling of the Thomas and Jenkins murders." "How very well deserved," Miss Marple replied. "He's a most thorough and conscientious officer. He reminds me somewhat of his uncle in that regard. He mentioned you in his report, you know. Said your insights were instrumental in solving the case." Dr. Haydock smiled. "When I saw him last week, he said if he ever encountered another seemingly impenetrable mystery, he would consult you first, not last." Miss Marple's cheeks colored slightly at the compliment. "Inspector Craddock is too kind. I merely observe and make connections. Living in a village for as long as I have, one develops a certain understanding of human nature." "A rather modest assessment of your considerable talents," Dr. Haydock remarked. "By the way, I understand the Blue Boar has new owners. Old Mr. Smithers finally retired." "Yes, a young couple from London, I believe. Mr. and Mrs. Ellis." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "They've been most anxious to hear all about the famous murder case. I fear they may be somewhat disappointed by our usual village tranquility. After the events of the past few months, I for one would welcome a little tranquility," Dr. Haydock said fervently. As they continued their conversation, Miss Marple noticed a familiar figure approaching along the lane. Catherine Melford, dressed in a simple blue suit that flattered her dark coloring. She carried a small bouquet of spring flowers. "Miss Marple, Dr. Haydock," Catherine greeted them warmly as she reached the garden gate. "I hope I'm not intruding. I wanted to thank you both personally before I returned to London." "Not at all, my dear," Miss Marple assured her. "We were just discussing the good news. Please, join us." Catherine entered the garden, presenting the flowers to Miss Marple with a shy smile. "These are from the garden at the house my father and Caroline shared. I visited it yesterday. The current owners were kind enough to allow me to see it and take some cuttings from the garden my father planted." "How thoughtful," Miss Marple said, touched by the gesture. "They're beautiful. I wanted you both to know what your help has meant to me." Catherine continued, taking the third garden chair. All these years, I've lived with the shadow of my father's supposed crime. Now, finally, that shadow has been lifted. It's been our privilege to help set the record straight, Dr. Haydock said gently. Your father was a good man and an excellent doctor. He deserved better than he received from the justice system. And from those he trusted, Catherine added, her expression sobering. The review revealed that Philippa Lawson had been plotting against my father for months before Caroline's death. She apparently resented him deeply for marrying her cousin. Some people cannot bear to see others happy when they themselves are not, Miss Marple observed. It's a flaw in character that can lead to terrible consequences when combined with intelligence and opportunity. Catherine nodded thoughtfully. The investigators found additional correspondence that suggests my aunt was aware of Philippa's intentions toward Caroline, though perhaps not the full extent of her plan. She may have believed Philippa only meant to cause trouble in the marriage, not murder. Such partial knowledge can be a dangerous thing, Miss Marple said. It allows people to participate in evil without fully acknowledging their own complicity. My aunt carried that guilt to her grave, Catherine said quietly. I found it in my heart to forgive her, though it hasn't been easy. The three sat together as the spring sun warmed the garden, discussing the case that had connected them and the future that now lay ahead. Catherine spoke of her plans for the foundation and her hope that it might prevent similar injustices. Dr. Haydock mentioned his intention to write a medical paper about the case, focusing on the misidentification of digitalis poisoning as arsenic toxicity. As Catherine prepared to leave, she turned to Miss Marple with genuine admiration. Mr. Thomas mentioned you in his notes, you know. He wrote that you had the most penetrating insight into human nature of anyone he had ever met. He was right. Miss Marple smiled, embarrassed but pleased. Mr. Thomas was a dedicated seeker of truth. It's a tragedy that his pursuit cost him his life. But not in vain, Catherine said firmly. His work and your insights have brought justice at last. After Catherine had gone, promising to visit whenever she returned to the area, Dr. Haydock lingered a moment longer. A satisfactory conclusion, he remarked, though not without its sorrows. Few cases are entirely without shadow, Miss Marple agreed. Even when justice is done, lives have been lost or damaged beyond repair. But truth has value in itself, Dr. Haydock insisted. Gerald would have wanted his name cleared, even posthumously. Yes, Miss Marple said softly. Truth matters, even when delayed. As Dr. Haydock took his leave, Miss Marple returned to her garden work, her thoughts turning over the events of the past months, the garden party that had ended in tragedy, the patient unraveling of decades-old deceptions, the final justice for Gerald Melford and Edward Thomas. St. Mary Mead would continue as it always had, its surface tranquility occasionally disturbed by the ripples of human passion and frailty, and she would continue to observe, to knit, to garden, and, when called upon, to help untangle those mysteries that baffled younger, more conventional minds. The afternoon sun warmed her shoulders as she bent over a bed of spring flowers. Saturday. The distance, church bells began to ring, calling the faithful to evening service. Miss Marple straightened, listening to their familiar pealing with a sense of deep contentment. Life went on. Justice, however delayed, had been served. And for now, at least, all was right in her small corner of the world.